Greetings and welcome to SCAR Speaks, a weekly podcast program brought to you by George Mason University School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. My name is de-Graft and I'm here with Sudha Rajput, who is here to talk to us about IDPs, or internally displaced persons. Sudha, please welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
So for my first question, what does it mean to be an IDP?
Well, an IDP, the term itself stands for internally displaced persons. And who these people are the people who have been forcibly evicted from their homes for a number of reasons. Natural disasters, it could be development projects, it could be ethnic conflicts in the country. So these are the people who have been forcibly evicted and they end up in the confines of their own countries. So the phenomena of IDP is quite a huge phenomena. Right now, an estimated 24.5 million people in the world is a global phenomena. So that's what IDP means.
What's the difference between what you just described and then a refugee? What's the distinction?
I'm glad that you're asking me that, because there's not a whole lot of clarity within the community on who is an IDP and who is a refugee. Actually, there are some misunderstandings on what these two terms, these category of people mean. The UN has defined an IDP as a person who has fled in search of safety, fear of persecution, many causes, and who has not crossed an internationally recognized border, a different country. And whereas a refugee also has been evicted for the same reasons, ethnic conflict, civil war, or overtake of the government, or it could be development projects, same causes. But the difference is where these two people end up in. If a person ends up in crossing an international border and ends up in a different country, they become a refugee of that country where they end up in. And on the other hand, a person who is trying to escape for the same reasons, but either chooses not to, or is not, the crossing of the border is not doable and remains within their country, they become IDP of their country, and so they maintain the nationality, citizenship of their country. And so the differences have a lot to do with how they are treated. The laws are very different for these two categories, although the causes of their eviction more or less the same, but it depends on where you end up, and where you end up it defines you as under the international umbrella, with refugees, or under your sovereign umbrella, which is your national government. So I'm glad that you're asking me that, because there is not a whole lot of clarity on this issue. So thanks for asking me these things.
Okay. But how did you get interested in this subject area of IDPs?
Well, after having worked at the World Bank for many years, over 2 decades, 3 decades, I had always been interested in international issues. And before I joined SCAR, I had some idea of what I wanted to do as part of my PhD studies. I was interested in the international border conflicts, for example, between Armenia and Azerbaijan. These are the countries that were under my focus at the World Bank. I was working for these countries. Like border conflicts between Georgia and Russia. So these kind of international conflicts interested me a lot. So when I came to SCAR, I had some kind of idea on what I would like to do for my PhD research. But attending my very first class here at SCAR, as my professor, he welcomed the students to the PhD program. And he gave a word of cautionary advice to the students, because students are, of course, going to, starting probably in the first year of their studies, are going to look into research topics that they will research. So he passed a cautionary advice to the students. He says that, of course, all of you will be doing a lot of research, and those of you who are interested in international research, topics of international nature, just be aware that knowing the culture and the language of a place is going to be helpful. So, and this was my professor, Professor Kevin Abrook, very esteemed professor of teaching here at SCAR. And his words stuck to my head. And I began focusing on my research interest. And keeping these two points seem to be the big drivers of successful research, knowing the culture and the language of a place. I began looking at border conflicts between India and Pakistan. I thought I know the language and I pretty much know the culture. So I began thinking of that conflict. I began thinking of that India and Pakistan in terms of something to do with my current knowledge of MBA program, which had focused on international trade. So I began thinking that, how can I look at that conflict from the point of view of bilateral trade or maybe cultural exchange programs and things like that. The more I thought about this topic, the more I began thinking that it may not be so doable as from the perspective of a student advising the government going bilateral international trades and so on. So to narrow down my interest in India and Pakistan, I began looking at refugee issues. And while I was looking at refugee issues, I came across another phenomena, another humanitarian crisis that had to do with the people who had not crossed the international border, and they are called the IDPs. I began thinking about this this group of people, and I came to realize that this is an area that not a whole lot of researchers have ventured into. Why? Because it's considered to be an internal matter of a country, and a lot of researchers and journalists are not encouraged to meddle. This actually is considered meddling if another organization interferes into IDP issues, including Amnesty International. So I came to a conclusion that this is an area that, as opposed to refugee issues, has not been so well understood and not so well explored. And so maybe this is what where I might fill in the research gaps. So I began thinking about how to get into this topic. Magnitude of 24.5 million is a global issue, and the people at the United Nations are calling it the worst humanitarian crisis of our times. But yet the irony is that a whole lot of people have not studied this issue, and mainly because the people don't meddle into another country's affairs. So I thought that this is it. This is what I want to do, and a lot of guidance from my SCAR professors on narrowing down. And so that's how I ended up with a very long story, but it just goes to show you that one may have a lot of larger interests, but when it comes down to looking at what is doable for a student of PhD, what you can do with the resources that you have. And then I thought having the language and the culture is my competitive advantage. So why make my research tougher than it has to be? So I put in these two strong drivers of mine into my research, and I'm very glad that Professor Abrook had advised the students. And this is actually a very doable thing when you know the culture and the language of a place. So I'm glad that you're asking me that.
But still staying on the theme of focusing you just brought up. I know the IDP situation, if it's anything to go by the refugee situation, it's such a huge topic.
Absolutely.
So what are some of the specific issues that your research will be focusing on?
Well, IDP issue is a very complex, and it can generate a number of conflicts if not handled properly. Complex yet multifaceted issue. Because why do I say that? Because the spillover effects from the internal displacement are many, and they touch all aspects of life. So the issues, just as I had explained the causes of internal displacement, which are natural disasters, man-made disasters, overthrow of governments, development goals itself, and ethnic conflicts. Because the causes are so many that can displace people from their own countries, naturally, the consequences, the spillover effects, the negative effects of this social phenomena that is not well understood are huge, are many. So there are many ways. Now you ask me what are the issues. Now I have to tell you that there are many ways of looking at the issues of displacement. You can look at the issues from the perspective of the displaced persons. You can look at the issues from the perspective of the people who are left behind, the communities, the broken communities, which I'm calling the fragmented communities. A whole lot of scholars and researchers don't really, when they're looking at IDP issues, they actually kind of ignore what has happened to the communities that people left behind. Then you can look at the issues from the perspective of the host community. I call the host community that community which receives the IDPs. So there are many ways of looking at the issues of IDPs. If you begin looking at the issue from the perspective of the displaced persons, they touch all parts of life of the displaced person. They are, for example, there are security issues which have to do with finding a secure haven to begin with. They're most of the time fleeing from fear of persecution. So the first and foremost issue has to do with security issue, finding safe haven. Then second, we, from the perspective of IDPs, now let's look at that for a moment. We have issues of psychosocial issues, psychological impact, the trauma of being evicted, social issues of integrating into a new community, those kind of issues. Then there are economic issues, the abrupt interruption of economic opportunities of the youth and the male households, that's a huge issue. Then health issues, exposure to different climates can be very devastating for people who have not stepped outside of their hometowns. So you can end up in intolerable heat, like my research participants who had gone from Kashmir, Maine, which is colder place, to the capital, which is a much hotter place. So exposure to heat, and then the unhealthy environment of the camps itself poses a lot of health hazards. Then we have political issues. By being away from your hometown, sometimes you end up losing your political rights, like voting rights. Then legal issues. Who advocates for you? How do you find people who are going to stand up for you? The legal counsel. And about the claim to property that you left behind. So these are legal issues. So from the perspective of the IDP alone, as I'm saying, there are so many issues, and they're all interlinked, because they touch the overall well-being of the displaced person. Then you're asking me about the issues. I can also tell you from the perspective of the people who are left behind. There are issues there also. A whole lot of people don't focus on them, but the people who are left behind, they have lost the services that the IDPs were performing. Lots of things get neglected when a whole lot of people through exodus leave your society. Schools become without teachers. Hospitals, they lose their doctors. The society loses its leaders. The farm animals, the businesses, the homes, they get neglected. There are not people to take care of them. So there's a lot of impact on the communities that are left behind. And in addition to that, the very framework of the community, the fragmented community, changes. The demographics changes. The whole landscape of the society changes forever. So it's not just the people who have been evicted, but the people who evicted them, their lives also change. And then I was telling you that we can look at the issues of IDPs from the perspective of the host community. Even if the host community is well-to-do and rich. With the arrival of this huge number of people, the community no doubt will be affected in many ways. First is the resource pressure. Even in a well-to-do community, you will have impact on the resources. Schools will get overcrowded, roads will be congested, there will be more pollution, no doubt, and jobs will be scarce. So there is, regardless of what kind of community that the IDPs enter, they might be welcome, they might not be welcome, but there are pressures on the host community itself. Second, that I have noted in my own research, which has to do with the Kashmir, what I have noted is the cultural diffusion. The IDPs that come to a new society, the cultural diversity may not be exactly what the host community welcomes. It brings diversity into your community, but this may not be the exact diversity that the host community welcomes. So there is cultural diffusion. And then of course social dynamics. When you have two groups living in the society, you are going to have group interaction, social dynamics of the society is going to change. You can also look at the issues from the perspective of the policy holders, policy implementers, their role in that. Now for my purpose, let me tell you, my research focuses on the Kashmir Valley. This is part of India, administered by India, the part of Kashmir. These are the people who were evicted from the Kashmir Valley where they used to live. Kashmir Valley is part of the Kashmir state. They were evicted because of militancy that took hold of the valley in 1989. So I'm looking at this population, which is like 250,000 population, and these are Kashmiri Hindus. They were evicted from the Kashmir Valley and they found themselves into different parts of India. So I'm looking at that population. Now for my purposes, I have divided the issues that I looked at into a certain model, into Dugan's nested model. I'm sure that you might be aware of being here at SCAR. So what I have done, I have looked at the issues that came out through my research by interviewing the people. I conducted face-to-face interviews with the displaced persons in the host community and the policymakers. The issues that came out through my research, I have put them into the nested model. And so the first and foremost issue for me that I'm looking at has to do with homelessness. When talking to the displaced people, the issue of homelessness, not exactly put like homelessness, but I'm putting it in those terms. People were saying they're without homes. But when I look around their apartments, I see that the government has actually provided homes for them. So for me, it's like, but you're not homeless. What they're telling me is that homelessness for them is having lost their cultural, social identity, their sense of belonging to the community, their ancestral homes. And so I'm looking at homelessness as a specific issue of displacement. Then, because I'm putting my research into a frame of Dugan's nested model, I look at the relational issues. Relational issues have to do with the mix of the people, the fit of the people into a society. So how do the people fit? What is the social dynamic? Then there are systemic issues. Systemic issues have to do with your educational background, your linguistic background, the way your social upbringing. So these things matter a lot in the phenomena of displacement as well as refugees. Then to complete my model, I'm looking at the model as instead of from the bottom to top, I'm looking at it from the top to bottom, and I look at the bottom like a well. At the bottom of the well, I see there are systemic, structural issues, which are like the overarching issues that affect the plight of the people. For example, the economic system. what is available to them, what resources are available to the displaced people when they arrive in a new community, legal systems, what are the resources, where can they go, who stands for them, political issues, how will they get their right to vote, and these are structural issues. They have to do a lot with the systems and structures that are accessible for the people. So this is how I have framed the issues that I have come up with through talking to the people. So there are, all these issues, what I'm trying to tell you is that they are not standalone issues. They are interrelated, they are multifaceted, and they touch other aspects of life, of IDPs, of policymakers, of everyone. So you get a good understanding if you consider the issues from multiple lenses. So just to tell you briefly that for me, issues are not standalone issues. They are interrelated and they have spillover effect. So that's why I have organized them in my research into this nested model, and hopefully it covers all the issues that I have researched so far. So these are the issues of the people, multifaceted phenomena of displacement.
You raised a number of very interesting points in what you just said, but who should be responsible for IDPs?
That's a very interesting question. And I don't think, to be serious with you, that a whole lot of people have actually looked at this issue as who is responsible. But after having done my field research, I have come to a conclusion that I used to think before going to the field in Kashmir, that it is maybe an international issue, a responsibility, or maybe a national responsibility. But now, having talked to the people, having talked to 94 participants, I've come to conclude that this is a shared responsibility. Why do I say that? Because as I'm saying that the issues affect other issues and other actors. Issues of displacement affect the people who were left behind as well as the people who are hosting them. So that's why I'm calling this a shared responsibility. Now, if you want to look at the legal responsibility, who is legally responsible, the United Nations makes it clear that it is a sovereign responsibility of the nations because they are within their own country. They are the subject of their own national leaders. So it's a national responsibility. Although in the United Nations, we have something called the guiding principles. Guiding principles, what they are, is that they, unlike the Refugee Convention you might have heard of, the Refugee Convention is legally applicable to the refugees. The countries that host refugees, they are legally bound to care for them in a certain way. As opposed to that, the IDP, these guiding principles that have been formulated by the United Nations also, they are not binding. They are soft laws. Soft laws means the sovereign nation has an option to adopt them or not. And you might well know that when you leave things to the government, sometimes the government will get away with doing nothing or doing very little. So what the governments have done, looking at my literature review, I covered a lot of literature review from the global perspective on how this issue has been covered. A lot of nations, Colombia for example, and now Turkey is doing a lot. What they're doing is that they're incorporating these guiding principles into their constitution, into the constitutional law. The problem comes in the implementation of these laws. They have written the laws, so it looks good. They get brownie points sometimes for that. But the thing is, the legal systems are not set up to implement these laws. So that's where the disconnect comes between the theory, which is the writing of the law, and the practical, which is the implementation. So you have a disconnect between theory and practice there. So countries do mind these laws, They do take them into account, but they're not. Nobody is accountable. But I think that it is an international issue, because when you have a whole lot of people leaving their societies, this mass exodus can actually destabilize a country. I mean, if you have frequent displacements, obviously you're going to have a destabilized situation, and that can have ripple effect on the countries that are connected to that country. So you can have a refugee inflow from the country that is going through displacement. So in other words, this becomes an international issue in my view, because if one country is destabilized because a whole lot of people are moving here and there, the neighbor will also be affected. So I think it's an international issue. Then the legal responsibility, as I said, is the sovereign responsibility. The nations are legally responsible for managing their internally displaced persons, but nobody gets a brown point. So sometimes lot is done, sometimes nothing is done. But I want to be little bit on the side of the governments, because I have seen that the governments do take care of the IDPs. Maybe not full coverage, but they do provide accommodations and food and supplies. The problems come when there is protracted displacement lasting 3 decades and so on. Then, in addition to the international responsibility and the national responsibility, the local responsibility is huge. As I walked around the communities in Kashmir, I noted that the local communities, they are actually they become the first responders when the people arrive in their communities. And although they're not legally responsible for the people who come and join their communities, but they have a social responsibility, because the demographics is changing. So they have a social responsibilities, and a lot of local communities do reach out. They reach out in many ways. For example, supplies, they will bring supplies for the IDPs, or they help them set up registration systems. They help the IDPs in introducing them to the know-how of the society, where things are. So the local communities are very helpful, and they take it upon their as a social responsibility. Then I don't want to say that lastly, but just as importantly are the IDPs themselves. The management of the IDPs falls on the IDPs themselves. Now, a lot of times you might notice that IDPs take the position of victimhood and powerlessness, and they give all their agency to the policymaker, and they wait. But going to the field, I noted that the IDPs that had taken some kind of a proactive approach in the management of their own displacement, in terms of maybe grassroots efforts. I met a number of social activists from Kashmir, the displaced Kashmiris, who had become very active member of their society, especially in Delhi when I went around, and I noted that a lot of people had take it upon themselves to set up little NGOs to advocate their own cause. And when people do that, not only are they helping their own group, but they are garnering the support of their community in their plight. And that has an impact on the policymakers as well, because policymakers see it. So the IDPs themselves can influence in the management of their own plight. So as you are asking me who is responsible for that, since the issue of IDP is multifaceted, similarly the management of IDPs is a shared responsibilities. You have to look at it from a joint project. Is a partnership. Everyone is affected when the IDPs join a community or leave a community. So everyone is affected. So I think everyone is responsible for the management of this humanitarian challenge, similar to the refugees, but so less understood. So this is what I'm trying to say, that this is not a standalone issue. is really interrelated and is embedded into other issues. So I'm glad that we are discussing this today, because a lot of awareness needs to be brought forward about this issue, and why is it not as widely explored as other issues of human crises. So I'm glad that you asked me the management of IDPs. I look at it as everyone's responsibility, but I think international communities, they should have the overall responsibility, especially in the cases where they see protracted displacement going on for 30 years and so on. If the country is not managing its resources, somebody has to come in and vouch for the IDPs. So in addition to making the soft laws, I think there needs to be something like a refugee convention for the IDPs. So there has to be some involvement, which is like a legally binding thing coming from international community. So.
Well, Sudha, we would like to thank you for your wonderful insights into the IDP situation, and we look forward to reading your research and having you back here to tell us everything you
thank you.
together.
Thank you. I'll be glad to come again whenever you're ready, and thank you so much for having me here. And when I do a little bit more of my research analysis, I'm writing the results right now, but after I have investigated some more results and connected some dots, I'll be happy to come here. And as I said, that this IDP issue really needs to be understood through multiple lenses. So we need to engage other scholars, and I'll be happy to come back to ESCAR and talk about that. Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.